January 17, 1947, Nuremberg, American Zone of Occupation. The room smells of cigarette smoke and mimeograph ink. Outside, sleet taps against blacked-out windows. Inside interrogation room 7B, a man sits with his hands folded on a table scarred by cigarette burns. His name is Hauptsturmführer Ernst Kiefer, former supply officer, SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungsamt, Economic Administrative Main Office. He is 41. His uniform is gone. He wears a grey wool suit that doesn't fit. The Allied interrogator, Captain Daniel Weiss, slides a leather folio across the table. Kiefer does not open it. He already knows what's inside. For 18 months he kept those logs himself, requisition forms, transport manifests, caloric charts, mortality schedules. He logged everything. That was his job. Precision, accountability, efficiency. The documents inside that folio represent something else now. They represent evidence. Evidence of a system that ran on paperwork, approval stamps, and human endurance calculated to the gram. Kiefer's testimony would not make headlines. There were no gas chambers in his jurisdiction, no execution pits, no medical experiments. His crime was administrative. He oversaw the movement and maintenance of a labor force, predominantly women, across a network of satellite camps attached to armament factories in Saxony and Thuringia. Between May 1943 and April 1945, his office processed transport orders for approximately 11,000 female prisoners, most of them Polish and Soviet nationals classified as political detainees or partisans. The logs he kept tracked their movement like industrial freight: departure dates, arrival confirmations, conditions upon receipt, estimated operational capacity. In his own handwriting, the word he used most often was not prisoner or inmate. It was Arbeitskraft, labor unit. What makes Kiefer's testimony unusual is not that he confessed, many did, under pressure or plea arrangements, but that he offered explanation, not justification, explanation. He described a system in which no single person gave an order to kill, yet thousands died on schedule. He described how a woman could be worked to death without anyone technically murdering her. This was not the sensational evil of the camps that filled newsreels. This was structural violence, bureaucratic endurance testing, and logistical pressure applied until the body failed. Kiefer's logs documented it in clinical language. Subject exhibited declining productivity. Replacement requested due to reduced operational output. Incident occurred during transfer. Subject expired en route. The word death appeared rarely. The word incident appeared often. The system Kiefer administered did not require sadism. It required schedules. The armament plants, Hassag, Gustloff-Werk, RMHG, operated under contracts with the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production. Albert Speer's office set production quotas. Factory managers requested labor. The SS provided it. Kiefer's job was to match supply with demand, ensure the cargo arrived intact enough to work, and manage attrition rates within acceptable margins. Women were transferred in groups of 50 to 200, packed into windowless freight cars for journeys lasting 12 to 36 hours. Kiefer's logs recorded transport losses, the percentage who arrived unconscious, injured, or dead. Acceptable loss, under 8%. Anything higher required a written incident report. He filed many. At the factories, the women worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer when production targets lagged. They assembled fuselage components, packed explosives, machined small arms parts. The work required dexterity, which is why women were preferred for certain tasks. It also required stamina. Daily rations averaged 1,100 to 1,400 calories, enough to sustain limited motor function, not enough to sustain health. Kiefer's office tracked caloric intake against output metrics. When productivity dropped below threshold, the individual was flagged. 3 flags in 2 weeks typically resulted in reassignment. Reassignment often meant transfer to a slower camp, a quarantine block, or return shipment to a central camp like Ravensbrück. Return shipments had the highest mortality rates. Kiefer logged those too. Returned due to medical unsuitability. Transferred for reconditioning. The interrogator asks Kiefer why he kept such detailed records. Kiefer's answer is simple: it was required. Every requisition needed documentation. Every transfer needed authorization. Every death needed a cause, even if the cause was listed as circulatory failure or general exhaustion. The system demanded accountability, so he provided it. He shows no emotion when he says this. Captain Weiss later writes in his report that Kiefer appeared to regard his role as purely administrative, absent moral dimension. But the logs themselves contain something else. In the margins, in Kiefer's handwriting, there are occasional notations that break the clinical tone: condition worsening faster than projected. Request immediate medical intervention, denied. Third request for blankets, unfulfilled. These notes were not required. Kiefer added them anyway. Whether this represents vestigial conscience or compulsive documentation remains unclear. What is clear is that his logs provide a window into a machinery of attrition. Women did not need to be shot to be eliminated. They simply needed to be worked at a calculated rate, fed at a calculated minimum, and replaced when the calculation failed. The system sustained itself through replenishment. For every woman who collapsed, another arrived. Kiefer's manifests show a rhythm: outgoing shipments of unserviceable units, incoming shipments of replacement labor, continuous throughput. The war economy required it. The factories required it. And men like Kiefer required forms, signatures, and logs to prove the system was functioning as designed. The horror was not in the excess, it was in the maintenance. Outside interrogation room 7B, the sleet continues. Inside, Captain Weiss opens the folio and begins reading transport dates aloud. Kiefer listens, nods occasionally, corrects a date. He remembers. Section 2. The system Kiefer administered did not originate with him. It evolved. To understand how a supply officer could log human deterioration as casually as spare parts inventory, one must first understand the architecture that made such logging possible and necessary. That architecture was built in stages, beginning long before the war, and it rested on a principle older than the Reich itself: that certain lives could be measured purely by their utility, and that utility could be quantified, managed, and exhausted. The SS-Wirtschaftsverwaltungsamt, known as WVHA, was established in February 1942 under the command of Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl. Its mandate was straightforward: extract maximum economic value from the concentration camp system. Prior to 1942, the camps operated primarily as detention and terror instruments. Pohl's reorganization transformed them into labor reservoirs. The shift was doctrinal. Himmler himself issued the directive: camps must become self-sustaining enterprises, contributing to war production while maintaining ideological functions. This required a new kind of management: accountants, logistics officers, supply coordinators, men like Kiefer. The WVHA subdivided into 5 main offices. Amt D, under Richard Glücks, oversaw camp administration. Amt W managed economic enterprises. Kiefer worked in a subsection liaison between the two, coordinating labor allocation for private contractors who leased prisoners from the SS at 4 to 6 Reichsmarks per day per worker. The prisoners themselves saw none of this. The companies paid the SS. The SS provided bodies. Kiefer ensured the delivery. By 1943, the demand for labor outstripped supply. Germany's military manpower was hemorrhaging on the Eastern Front. Civilian men were conscripted. Factories faced catastrophic shortages. The solution was expansion: foreign laborers, prisoners of war, and camp inmates. Women, previously underutilized in heavy industry, became essential. In October 1942, Himmler authorized the large-scale deployment of female prisoners to armament production. The first transports left Ravensbrück, the central women's camp, in early 1943. Kiefer's logs begin in May of that year, coinciding with the establishment of the first major female satellite camps in his jurisdiction: Altenburg, attached to the RIMAHG Messerschmitt plant, and Torture, servicing the Hassag munitions works. Each camp housed between 800 and 1,500 women. Each operated under the same premise: the body was a depletable resource, and depletion was acceptable as long as replacement was assured. The camps themselves were not designed for long-term habitation. They were industrial adjuncts. Barracks were wooden, uninsulated, built to the same specifications as military field structures. Sleeping platforms ran 3 tiers high, no mattresses, thin straw pallets replaced monthly if supplies allowed. Heating was minimal. a single iron stove per barracks housing 200 women. Winter temperatures inside averaged 4 to 7 degrees Celsius. Kiefer's requisition forms frequently requested additional blankets, coal allotments, insulation materials. Most requests were denied or partially filled. The logic was economic. If the workers did not freeze to death outright, incremental discomfort was tolerable. Camp commandants were evaluated not on humane conditions, but on output metrics. A well-run camp was one that met production quotas with minimal disruption. Disease outbreaks, strikes, or mass deaths that halted factory operations were considered management failures. Kiefer's logs reflect this priority. When he notes outbreak of dysentery, production reduced by 18%, the emphasis is not on the outbreak itself, but on the production loss. The workday began at 4:30 a.m. roll call at 5:00. March to the factory by 5:30, often a 2-kilometer walk in darkness. Shifts ran until 6:00 p.m., then return march, evening roll call, food distribution. Lights out at 9:00 p.m. In practice, many factories imposed extended shifts, 14-16 hours when quotas lagged. Kiefer's office received shift reports weekly. He cross-referenced them with mortality data. There was an observable threshold. Sustained shifts beyond 14 hours correlated with sharp increases in medical incidents within 3 weeks. He noted this in a memo dated August 1943, recommending shift caps to preserve workforce viability. The recommendation was ignored. The factories could not afford reduced output. The front needed shells, aircraft parts, gun mechanisms. The Reich needed them faster than bodies could sustain producing them. So the bodies were pushed further. Food was the primary control lever. Daily rations were divided into 3 categories based on labor intensity. Light labor, 1,100 calories. Medium labor, 1,400 calories. Heavy labor, 1,700 calories. The women in Kiefer's jurisdiction were classified as medium labor, though the work, lifting metal components, operating hydraulic presses, handling chemical compounds, qualified as heavy by any objective standard. The rations consisted of ersatz coffee at dawn, watery soup at midday, bread and margarine in the evening. Protein was rare. Vegetables were rare. The soup was often turnip or kohlrabi water, occasionally with bits of potato or spoiled meat. Kiefer's logs document multiple requests for ration increases based on declining productivity metrics. The responses were formulaic. Current allocations deemed sufficient per WVHA guidelines. Sufficient in this context meant sufficient to maintain short-term function. Long-term survival was not a design parameter. Medical care existed in theory. Each camp had an infirmary, staffed by 1 or 2 SS medical personnel and prisoner nurses. In practice, the infirmaries functioned as sorting stations. Women presenting with fever, injury, or exhaustion were assessed for work capacity. Those deemed recoverable within a week received minimal treatment, aspirin, bandages, rest. Those deemed unlikely to recover were flagged for transfer. Kiefer's logs use the term arbeitsunfähig, incapable of work. This classification was functionally a death sentence. Women marked arbeitsunfähig were gathered in periodic shipments, usually 30 to 60 at a time, and returned to Ravensbrück or other central camps. Many died in transit. Those who arrived were often sent directly to the so-called invalid blocks, where care was withheld. Some were selected for execution. Others simply deteriorated. Kiefer logged outgoing shipments, but rarely received confirmation of outcomes. The system did not require it. His responsibility ended at departure. What emerges from Kiefer's testimony and his logs is not a portrait of exceptional cruelty, but of systematic neglect calibrated to economic necessity. The women were not murdered outright because their labor was valuable, but they were not preserved because preservation was expensive. The result was a slow grind, 12-hour days, inadequate food, untreated illness, relentless cold, and the constant psychological weight of knowing that any sign of weakness meant removal. The system required no overt violence. It required only indifference and arithmetic. Kiefer provided both. He calculated how many women a factory needed, how long they could work before collapse, and how many replacements to order. He did this with the same diligence he might apply to ordering machine lubricant or rivets. The logs prove it. Columns of numbers, dates, cause codes, no names, just units processed, units depleted, units replaced. Captain Weiss asks him, during the third day of interrogation, whether he ever considered the women as individuals. Kiefer pauses, then he says, "I considered them as my responsibility." He does not elaborate. He does not need to. The logs speak for him. June 12, 1943, Altenburg subcamp, Thuringia. The factory floor is a cavern of noise, metal presses slamming, conveyor belts grinding, ventilation fans roaring to exhaust chemical fumes. The women work in rows, 12 to a line, assembling wing components for Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. Their hands move in practiced rhythm: bolt, rivet, inspect, pass. The quota is 8 units per hour per worker. Falling below 7 triggers a supervisor's note. 3 notes in a week triggers a report. The reports go to the camp commandant, who forwards them to Kiefer's office. He logs them, files them, and when enough accumulate, he processes a requisition for replacements. In Transport Manifest 43A176, dated June 19, 1943, Kiefer records the arrival of 140 women from Ravensbrück. Their prisoner numbers range from 22,000 to 22,140. No names, the manifest notes. General condition, serviceable. This is bureaucratic optimism. By the time they disembark at Altenburg station, 6 are unconscious from dehydration. 2 die within 24 hours. Kiefer logs the deaths as transport-related incidents and adjusts his efficiency calculations. Transport mortality above 8% is unacceptable, but 1.4% falls within tolerance. The remaining 138 women are deloused, shaved, issued work dresses, and assigned to factory barracks. Within 3 days, they are on the production line. Within 3 weeks, 14 are in the infirmary. Within 3 months, 41 have been flagged as arbeitsunfähig and marked for return shipment. Kiefer's logs from this period show a pattern that repeats across every camp in his network. New arrivals work at near-target productivity for 10 to 14 days, the body drawing on reserves, adrenaline masking deficiency. Then a decline begins. Productivity drops 5 to 8% in the second month, 12 to 15% by the third. Physical symptoms appear: edema in the legs, skin lesions, gum bleeding, hair loss, menstruation cessation. The medical term is dystrophy. The camp term is Muselmann, borrowed from the men's camps, a figure so emaciated and depleted that survival is statistically improbable. Kiefer does not use this term in official logs. He uses reduced operational capacity and declining output metrics. The meaning is the same. What the logs also reveal in aggregate is the speed of attrition. A woman arriving in May 1943 has a 50% probability of being medically unfit by November. If she survives to February 1944, the probability rises to 70%. These are not Kiefer's calculations. They are derived from his data, analyzed decades later by historians cross-referencing transport records with mortality lists. But Kiefer understood the trend in real time. His August 1943 memo, referenced earlier, explicitly states, current operational model projects full workforce turnover every 9 to 11 months. Sustainability requires either increased provisioning or expanded replacement pipeline. The response from WVHA was unambiguous: expand the pipeline. Provisioning costs were non-negotiable. Prisoners were cheaper than food. The factories themselves were complicit but distanced. Private contractors, IMHG Hassag, Gusloff, paid the SS for labor and bore no direct responsibility for prisoner welfare. Camp commandants reported to the SS, not to factory management. This created a buffer. Factory foremen could demand higher output without witnessing the consequences. When a woman collapsed at her station, she was removed by camp guards, not factory personnel. The foreman simply requested a replacement. Kiefer processed the request. The system functioned through segmentation. No single actor bore full responsibility, so responsibility dissolved into procedure. Yet there were cracks. In September 1943, the Hassag plant in Torture reported a production shortfall of 22%. The cause: 18 workers hospitalized simultaneously with chemical burns from improperly ventilated TNT packing stations. Kiefer's log entry notes: incident caused by inadequate safety protocol, factory management notified. The company response was to install additional ventilation fans, but only in sections where German civilian workers were employed. The prisoner sections remained unchanged. Within 2 months, another 12 women were hospitalized. This time, Kiefer's log includes a marginal note: repeated exposure without mitigation. Request immediate review. No review occurred. Production resumed. The women returned to the line or were replaced. There is a document in Kiefer's files that stands apart from the clinical logs. It is a handwritten letter dated November 4, 1943, addressed to the WVHA Medical Office. In it, Kiefer requests an inspection of sanitary conditions at the Altenburg camp, citing abnormal mortality rates inconsistent with projected attrition models. He lists specific concerns: lack of potable water, inadequate latrine facilities, insufficient delousing capacity, overcrowded barracks leading to respiratory infection spread. The letter is formal, procedural, absent sentimentality, but it is also a deviation. He was not required to write it. His mandate was labor logistics, not camp conditions. The letter was filed and ignored. 3 weeks later, a typhus outbreak at Altenburg killed 37 women in 12 days. Kiefer logged each death, cause of death listed as infectious disease, and requisitioned 40 replacement workers to restore factory capacity. Captain Weiss asks Kiefer why he wrote the letter. Kiefer's answer: the mortality rate was inefficient. It disrupted supply continuity. Weiss presses: but you knew the conditions were killing them. Kiefer hesitates. Then, I knew the conditions were substandard. I reported it through proper channels. Weiss: and when nothing Chan. Jed Kiefer: I continued my duties. There is no defiance in his voice, no shame either, just a flat factual recitation. He reported a problem. The problem was not addressed. He adapted his logistics to compensate. That was his job. The logs from late 1943 into early 1944 show an escalation. The Wehrmacht's losses in the east and Italy created even greater labor shortages. Factories increased shift lengths. The WVHA pushed more prisoners into production. Kiefer's requisitions doubled. Transport frequency increased from biweekly to weekly. The camps swelled beyond capacity. Barracks designed for 150 held 220. Food supplies, already inadequate, stretched thinner. Kiefer's logs record multiple requests for emergency rations. Most were denied. In January 1944, he logged 15 deaths in a single week at the torture camp: malnutrition, pneumonia, exhaustion. The next week, 18. The week after, 21. He requisitioned 60 replacements. They arrived within 10 days. The cycle continued. One entry, dated February 8, 1944, is notable for its brevity. Transport 44A34, 47 units dispatched, 11 expired en route. Cause: exposure, duration 16 hours in unheated car, external temperature degrees C, remaining 36 delivered to Altenburg. The train had been delayed by Allied bombing of the rail line. The women, locked in freight cars with no heat, no water, no sanitation, waited while repairs were made. 11 froze to death. Kiefer logged it as a transport loss, calculated the percentage, 23.4%, well above acceptable margins, and filed an incident report. The report recommended insulated transport cars for winter months. The recommendation was noted and not implemented. The war economy could not spare resources for prisoner comfort. The deaths were regrettable inefficiencies, nothing more. What becomes clear in Kiefer's testimony is that he operated within a framework that normalized attrition. Deaths were not aberrations, they were data points. The system anticipated them, planned for them, and compensated through continuous replenishment. Kiefer's role was not to prevent deaths, but to manage their impact on productivity. He did so with meticulous accuracy: every loss logged, every replacement ordered, every inefficiency noted, even when noting changed nothing. He was a faithful servant of a system designed to consume human beings at a calculated rate. The logs are the proof: columns of figures, transport dates, mortality codes, replacement orders, a paper trail of administrative murder recorded by a man who saw himself not as a killer, but as a clerk. And perhaps that is the most damning evidence of all. March 22, 1944. WVHA headquarters, Oranienburg. A meeting convenes in a conference room that smells of floor wax and stale tobacco. Present: logistics officers from 6 regional jurisdictions, 2 representatives from the Armaments Ministry, and Oberfuhrer Gerhard Maurer, head of Amt DI, responsible for prisoner labor allocation across the entire camp system. The subject of the meeting is productivity shortfalls in the eastern armament plants. The minutes recovered after the war are typed on thin onion skin paper, stamped secret, for internal distribution only. Ernst Kiefer is not present, but his reports are. They sit in a folder labeled Thuringia Saxony Labor Pool Analysis, Q4 1943, Q1 1944. The reports document what Maurer already suspects. The system is cannibalizing itself. The numbers are stark. Average prisoner lifespan in armament labor, from arrival to incapacitation, has dropped from 11 months to 7. Replacement demand has increased 40% year-over-year. Transport infrastructure, strained by Allied bombing and fuel shortages, cannot keep pace. Factories are running at 70 to 80% labor capacity. Production quotas are missed. Maurer's directive is unambiguous: increase labor efficiency without increasing provisioning costs. The officers present understand the contradiction. You cannot extract more work from bodies receiving less fuel, but the contradiction is not theirs to resolve. It is theirs to implement. Kiefer's reports are cited specifically. His data shows that women in the Thuringia plants are reaching incapacitation thresholds 30 to 40 days faster than men in comparable roles. The reason is physiological. Women enter the camps with lower body mass and lower caloric reserves. The same deprivation that reduces a man to marginal function in 8 months reduces a woman to the same state in 5. Maurer proposes a solution: reduce the length of labor assignment. Instead of working prisoners until they collapse, rotate them out earlier, before they become entirely unserviceable, and send them to recovery camps where minimal feeding might restore partial function. Then return them to labor. The model is cyclical: extract, rest, extract again. In theory, it extends total usable labor hours. In practice, it depends on infrastructure that does not exist. There are no recovery camps. There is no surplus food. The proposal is recorded in the minutes and quietly shelved. What emerges instead is a different calculus: accept higher attrition, but accelerate throughput. If prisoners are lasting 7 months instead of 11, then the solution is to process more prisoners through the system in less time. Raids across occupied Poland and the Soviet Union intensify. Transport trains arrive more frequently. Kiefer's logs reflect the shift. In April 1944 alone, he processes 620 new arrivals across his 3 primary camps, nearly double the monthly average from the previous year. The camps cannot absorb them. Barracks are packed beyond structural tolerance. Latrines overflow. The water supply, already insufficient, becomes critical. Dysentery spreads. Kiefer logs 18 deaths in the first week of April, 23 in the second, 29 in the third. He requests emergency medical supplies and additional barracks construction. Both requests are denied. The response from WVHA: maximize existing infrastructure, maintain production continuity. He does. The women sleep in shifts, rotating through bunk space. Those too ill to work are moved to quarantine sections, unheated sheds at the camp perimeter, where they lie on bare floors until they recover or die. Most die. Kiefer logs them as medical attrition, non-transport related. The factories continue operating. The quotas are met barely, and the cycle accelerates. But something else is happening, something Kiefer's logs cannot fully capture, but his testimony later reveals. The prisoners are breaking differently now, not just physically, psychologically. The earlier transports, women arrested in 1942 and early 1943, had retained some resilience, some spark of defiance or hope. By mid-1944, that is vanishing. The new arrivals come from liquidated ghettos, from partisan sweeps, from villages burned in reprisal operations. They have seen their families killed. They have survived death marches. They arrive already half destroyed, and the camps finish the job. Kiefer describes them in his Nuremberg testimony as absent. He struggles to find the right word in German, finally settling on leer empty. He says, they worked, but it was mechanical, no resistance, no communication. Just movement until movement stopped. This emptiness is not accidental. It is the intended result. A prisoner who has given up does not rebel, does not sabotage, does not require as much surveillance. The system does not need to break them through violence, it breaks them through relentlessness. 12-hour shifts, hunger that never abates, cold that seeps into bone, the knowledge that there is no end, no reprieve, no appeal, just work until you cannot, then vanish. The logs reflect this in their language. Earlier entries occasionally note disciplinary incidents or work refusals. By mid-1944, such entries disappear. There is nothing to discipline. The prisoners comply because they lack the energy not to. Captain Weiss, reading through Kiefer's later logs, notices an anomaly. In July 1944, Kiefer logged a transport of 83 women from Altenburg to Ravensbrück, a return shipment of Arbeitsunfähig prisoners. But in the margin he wrote, condition upon departure, 26 non-ambulatory, 11 unconscious, estimated survival to destination below 50%. Weiss asks why he included this notation. Kiefer responds, it was relevant to transport planning. If more than half would not survive the journey, it affected logistics. Weiss, you knew they were being sent to die. Kiefer, I knew they could not work. What happened after they left my jurisdiction was not my responsibility. The transport in question arrived at Ravensbrück on July 14, 1944. Camp records show 38 women dead on arrival. The remaining 45 were sent to the invalid block. None survived past August. Kiefer did not receive this information. He did not need it. His logs closed the entry with transport completed. The women ceased to exist in his system. They had served their function and been removed. The machinery continued. Yet there is one log entry that suggests something more, perhaps not conscience, but recognition. September 3, 1944, Kiefer writes, total registered workforce across 3 camps, 2,847, total flagged for medical removal, 1,203, percentage, 42.3%, replacement rate insufficient to maintain current output levels, system approaching critical threshold. He underlines the last sentence twice. This is not routine notation. This is alarm, not alarm for the prisoners, but alarm for the system itself. It is collapsing under its own logic. You cannot work people to death faster than you can replace them and expect the machine to run indefinitely. Kiefer sees this, he reports it, and he is ignored. By autumn 1944, the Eastern Front is disintegrating. The Red Army is advancing through Poland. Allied forces are pushing into Germany from the west. The armament factories, already struggling, face new crises, bombing raids, supply shortages, evacuations. Kiefer's jurisdiction is ordered to prepare for possible camp liquidations, destroy records, transfer prisoners westward, erase evidence. He begins pulling files, burning duplicates, sending originals to secure archives. But he does not burn everything. Some logs he keeps, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as evidence. Perhaps because a man who spent 2 years documenting every death cannot quite let the documentation disappear. In his final report, dated January 1945, Kiefer summarizes his entire operation. Total prisoners processed, 11,340. Total flagged for medical removal, 6,890. Total deaths recorded within his jurisdiction, 2,120. Total unaccounted for after transfer, 3,488. He notes, in the final line, records incomplete due to evacuation disruptions. Actual figures likely higher. It is the closest he comes to admitting what his logs have always implied, that the system he served was designed not to utilize prisoners, but to consume them, and that he knew. The war ends 4 months later. Kiefer is arrested in May 1945, attempting to cross into Switzerland with false papers. In his possession, a briefcase containing partial copies of his transport logs. He tells his captors he kept them for legal protection. Captain Weiss believes he kept them because he could not stop being what he was, a clerk, a recorder, a man who measured horror in columns and rows, and who needed the numbers to be accurate, even when accuracy condemned him. April 11, 1945, Altenburg subcamp, Thuringia. The Americans arrive at 3:17 p.m. The guards abandon the camp 3 days earlier, retreating westward ahead of Patton's Third Army. What remains is silence and the smell of rot. The barracks doors hang open. Inside, the soldiers find women lying on wooden platforms, too weak to stand. Some try to speak, most just stare. A medic from the 89th Infantry Division later writes in his diary, "They didn't look human anymore, just shapes under rags. I didn't know if they were alive until one blinked." The camp holds 430 women. 73 die within the first week of liberation, their bodies too damaged to survive even with food and medical care. The soldiers bury them in a field east of the camp. No markers, no names, just coordinates recorded in a military log. This scene repeats across dozens of subcamps in Thuringia, Saxony, Silesia. The Wehrmacht is collapsing. The SS is evacuating camps, marching prisoners westward in columns that leave bodies along every road. Some camps are liberated intact. Others are found empty, burned, prisoners shot in the final hours. The liberators document what they see: photographs, film reels, witness statements. The images circulate. The world reacts with shock, but the shock is selective. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the mass grave, these dominate the narrative. The subcamps, the labor camps, the women worked to death in factories, these become footnotes. The horror is easier to comprehend when it is spectacular. The quiet, grinding death of Kiefer's system does not photograph as well. Yet the evidence is there in the bodies themselves. Medical officers examining survivors note universal symptoms: severe malnutrition, edema, suppurating skin lesions, chronic dysentery, untreated fractures, chemical burns, tuberculosis, typhus. Average body weight among adult women survivors, 32 to 38 kilograms. Pre-war average for the same demographic, 55 to 60 kilograms. They have lost nearly 40% of their body mass. Their menstrual cycles have ceased. Their bones are brittle. Their immune systems are destroyed. Many will not survive the year despite intervention. Those who do will carry the damage for life: shortened lifespans, chronic illness, infertility, psychological fractures that no medicine can address. The liberators also find documents. Not many, most were burned, but enough. Transport manifests, work rosters, mortality lists, and in some camps, requisition logs signed by supply officers. Kiefer's name appears on dozens. His signature, neat and legible, authorizing transports, approving labor allocations, acknowledging receipt of unserviceable units. The documents are collected, catalogued, shipped to Allied intelligence offices. They form part of the evidentiary basis for the Nuremberg trials. Not the main trials. The 23 defendants in the dock are higher ranking, more visible. But the subsidiary trials, the ones prosecuting lower-level functionaries, bureaucrats, administrators, men like Kiefer. His trial begins in February 1947, part of the Pole trial, formerly the United States of America v. Oswald Pole, et al. 18 defendants, all linked to the WVHA and the economic administration of the camps. Kiefer is a secondary figure. His name does not make international headlines, but his logs do. The prosecution enters them as Exhibit 87C, trans. Port and labor allocation records, Thuringia, Saxony region, May 1943, January 1945. The logs run to 347 pages. The judges read them. The prosecutors cite them. Kiefer does not deny their authenticity. He compiled them himself. The defense strategy is predictable: superior orders. Kiefer's attorney argues that his client was a mid-level logistics officer with no authority to set policy, no control over camp conditions, no role in the decision to use concentration camp labor. He followed orders. He processed paperwork. He did not kill anyone. The prosecution counters with Kiefer's own words, pulled from his testimony. Did you know the prisoners were dying? Yes. Did you know the conditions were inadequate? Yes. Did you continue processing transports? Yes. The defense argues that refusal would have meant his own arrest, possibly execution. The prosecution argues that this does not absolve him. Men have moral choices even under duress. Kiefer made his. Verdict, delivered in August 1947, finds Kiefer guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The judgment is specific. The defendant knowingly participated in a system designed to exploit and destroy human life. His meticulous records demonstrate awareness of the consequences of his actions. That he did not personally commit acts of violence is immaterial. He facilitated, documented, and sustained a machinery of death. His guilt is established beyond doubt. The sentence, 15 years imprisonment. He serves 11, reduced for cooperation and health reasons. He is released in 1958, returns to West Germany, and disappears into civilian life. He takes a job as an accountant for a textile firm in Cologne. He does not speak publicly about his past. He dies in 1973, age 67, of heart failure. His obituary lists him as a retired businessman, no mention of the war. But the logs survive. They sit in archives now, the National Archives in Washington, the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, the Arolsen Archives in Bad Arolsen. Researchers access them, historians cite them, educators use them to teach about the banality of systemic violence. The logs have become evidence not just of Kiefer's guilt, but of a broader truth, that atrocity does not require monsters. It requires systems and men willing to operate them. The women Kiefer logged have been harder to trace. Most left no records beyond prisoner numbers. Some survivors testified at trials, gave statements to reparations boards, recorded oral histories decades later. Their accounts corroborate what the logs imply. They describe the 12-hour shifts, the starvation rations, the cold, the illness, the relentless grind. They describe watching friends collapse, disappear, die. They describe being treated not as people but as units, interchangeable, expendable, replaceable. One survivor, Zofia Adamczyk, testified in 1963, "We knew we were not supposed to survive. We were just supposed to work until we couldn't. Then they would bring someone else. It was efficient." Efficiency, the word recurs. Kiefer used it constantly. The system demanded it. The factories required it. But efficiency in this context meant something monstrous. It meant calculating how little a human being could subsist on while still producing value. It meant measuring the exact point at which a body would fail. It meant designing a structure where death was not a failure, but a predictable output, managed and documented like any other resource expenditure. Kiefer's logs are a monument to that efficiency. Every entry, a life reduced to a line. Every total, a mass of suffering rendered as arithmetic. The psychological toll on survivors is incalculable. Studies conducted in the 1960s and 1970s document pervasive trauma, nightmares, dissociation, survivor guilt, chronic anxiety, difficulty forming attachments. Many never speak of their experiences, even to family. The memories are too corrosive. Some carry physical reminders, scars, deformities, chronic pain that never let them forget. Others carry invisible wounds. The women who survived Kiefer's system did not merely endure deprivation. They endured dehumanization, the systematic erasure of their individuality, the reduction of their existence to labor output and mortality statistics. That damage does not heal. And yet some found ways to resist that erasure. Oral histories reveal small acts of defiance, sharing extra scraps of food, hiding the sick to delay their transfer, maintaining names and identities in whispered conversations. These acts did not change the system. They did not stop the deaths, but they preserved something, dignity, humanity, connection, in the face of a machinery designed to obliterate all three. The logs do not record these acts. Kiefer would not have seen them as relevant. But they were the counter-narrative to his columns and rows. They were proof that even in the most efficient system of dehumanization, the human persists. Captain Weiss, in his final report on the Kiefer interrogation, writes, "Subject demonstrates no apparent remorse. He describes atrocities in the language of logistics. One senses not a moral void, but a moral compartmentalization. He saw his duty as ensuring the system functioned, not questioning whether the system should exist. This is perhaps more dangerous than outright sadism. A sadist can be identified, resisted. A functionary is invisible until the damage is done." The damage was immense, and it was done with ledgers, manifests, and requisition forms, signed in triplicate. November 2024, Berlin Federal Archives. A researcher sits in a climate-controlled reading room, white cotton gloves on her hands, turning pages that smell faintly of acid and age. The document before her is Transport Manifest 43A176, the same manifest Kiefer logged on June 19, 1943. She is cross-referencing it with a database of prisoner numbers, trying to attach names to the anonymized entries. Prisoner 22,089, Maria Kowalska, age 24, schoolteacher from Lublin, arrested for suspected partisan connections. Prisoner 22,103, Natalia Vishnevskaya, age 19, factory worker from Minsk, arrested during a reprisal sweep. Prisoner 22,127, Sarah Levin, age 31, seamstress from Lodz, arrested for being Jewish. The researcher types each name into the database. Some yield further records, testimonies, death certificates, compensation claims. Others yield nothing. The person existed, was numbered, worked, and vanished. Only Kiefer's log confirms they were ever there. This is the afterlife of atrocity, names recovered from numbers, stories reconstructed from fragments, absences mapped where records end. The researcher's work is painstaking. It will take years, and even then thousands will remain unidentified. The system that Kiefer served was designed in part to erase, not just lives but identities. Prisoners were stripped of names upon arrival, assigned numbers, referred to by those numbers in all official documentation. If they died, the number was retired. If they survived, they carried the number as a scar, tattooed in some camps, or simply burned into memory. The dehumanization was structural, linguistic, bureaucratic. You cannot efficiently process human beings if you see them as human, so the system renamed them units, labor, cargo. Yet Kiefer's logs, intended as instruments of that erasure, have become tools of recovery. Because he recorded every transport, every transfer, every death, researchers can now trace movements, reconstruct timelines, identify victims. The irony is bitter. The same obsessive documentation that enabled the system's efficiency now enables its exposure. Kiefer created a paper trail he thought would demonstrate his diligence. Instead, it demonstrates his complicity. Every entry is an indictment. Every number, a life he helped destroy. The question that haunts the archive, that haunts every trial transcript and survivor testimony, is simple and unanswerable. Why? Why did men like Kiefer comply? Why did they not refuse, resist, sabotage? The easy answer is fear. Refusal meant punishment, possibly death. But the trials revealed something more complex. Many functionaries, Kiefer included, were never explicitly threatened. They were simply told the work was necessary, the prisoners were enemies of the state, the system was lawful. They were given forms to fill out, procedures to follow, quotas to meet, and they did, not because they were coerced at gunpoint, but because the system made compliance easy and resistance unthinkable. The bureaucracy insulated them from the human consequences of their actions. Kiefer did not see corpses, he saw numbers on a page, he did not hear screams. He heard production reports. The system was designed to fragment responsibility so completely that no one felt responsible. This is the architecture of systemic evil, diffusion of agency, normalization of atrocity, insulation from consequence. Kiefer signed transport orders, but he did not load the trains. Camp commandants enforced labor quotas, but they did not set them. Factory managers demanded output, but they did not witness the workers' collapse. The SS provided prisoners, but companies paid for them. Everyone participated, no one was culpable. Or everyone was, which in practical terms meant no one. The Nuremberg trials attempted to pierce this diffusion, to assign individual guilt within a collective crime. They succeeded partially. Men were convicted, sentenced, imprisoned. But the deeper question, how ordinary men become instruments of atrocity, remains unresolved. Hannah Arendt, observing the Eichmann trial in 1961, coined the phrase, the banality of evil. She described Eichmann not as a monster, but as a bureaucrat, a man who followed orders, filled out forms, and never questioned the system he served. Kiefer fits this profile precisely. He was not ideologically fanatical. He did not express hatred in his logs. He simply did his job efficiently and thoroughly within a system that turned human beings into expendable resources. Arendt's insight was that such men are not exceptional, they are ordinary, and that ordinariness is what makes them so dangerous. Monsters are rare, bureaucrats are everywhere. The question then is not whether such systems can emerge again, but how to prevent them. The easy answer is law, international tribunals, human rights conventions, mechanisms of accountability. These exist now, forged in the aftermath of the war, but law is only as strong as the will to enforce it, and history since 1945 has shown that will to be inconsistent. Genocides have occurred in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, Myanmar. Each time the machinery is different, but the structure is familiar. Dehumanization, bureaucratic facilitation, diffusion of responsibility, normalization of atrocity. Each time ordinary people participate. Each time, the world reacts with shock and promises, never again. And each time, it happens again. What then is the lesson of Kiefer's logs? Perhaps it is this, that atrocity does not announce itself with clarity. It arrives in the language of necessity, efficiency, order. It asks not for your cruelty, but for your compliance. It does not require you to hate, only to obey. It fragments the moral question into 1,000 administrative tasks, each individually defensible, collectively monstrous. And it relies on your willingness to see the task, but not the consequence. To fill out the form, but not to ask what the form enables. To do your job and nothing more. Kiefer did his job. 11,000 women passed through his system. Thousands died. He logged everyone. And when asked years later whether he felt responsible, he said only that he had followed procedure. Perhaps he believed that. Perhaps he needed to believe it, because the alternative, that he had knowingly facilitated mass death, was unendurable. Or perhaps he simply never asked himself the question. Perhaps the system was so complete, so normalized, so structured, that moral doubt never had space to form. He saw himself as a clerk. The logs prove he was more. The researcher in Berlin closes the manifest, requests the next box. Inside are more logs, more transports, more numbers. She will spend weeks here, months, translating the bureaucratic shorthand into human stories. It is necessary work, because every name recovered is an act of resistance against the erasure Kiefer's system intended. Every identity restored is proof that the machinery, however efficient, could not complete its task. The women whose numbers fill these pages were meant to disappear. They were worked, depleted, discarded, but the logs remain, and through them, so do the women. There is no redemption in this. Kiefer is dead, the women are dead, the factories are ruins, the camps are memorials. The past cannot be undone, but it can be remembered, and in the remembering perhaps there is a warning that systems matter more than intentions, that compliance is a choice even when it does not feel like one, that the language we use shapes the horror we permit, that efficiency, divorced from morality, is monstrous. And that the logs we keep, the forms we sign, the procedures we follow, all of it matters, all of it leaves a trace, and all of it someday will be read by someone asking why. Kiefer's logs answer that question with brutal clarity, because it was my job, because I was ordered, because the system required it, because I saw numbers, not people, because I followed the rules, because everyone else was doing it, because I never thought to stop. In the archive, the pages turn, the numbers accumulate, the silence deepens, and somewhere in that silence, 11,000 women wait for their names to be spoken again.